Martin Wolf. I'm the Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. The core message of my talk was based on my book, The Shifts and the Shocks. I suppose I had three main points. The first is that the crisis we've been through is a very important economic event. It has had enormous costs. Our national income and that of the other developed countries, so it's the whole Western world, is much smaller now than was expected some 7 or 8 years ago. Unemployment in many countries remains very high, and growth has not recovered in pretty well any country, particularly if you look at underlying growth, productivity growth, to where it was before the crisis. So this is a very big and important event which needs to be understood, and which I think has not been treated by economists as seriously as it deserves. The second point is, in my view, it was the result of the interaction between very profound macroeconomic shifts, the shifts in the title, particularly globalization and the associated rise, particularly after the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, of huge current account surpluses or huge capital outflows, net capital outflows from emerging countries into the developed countries. And this was happening at the same time, particularly after the stock market crashed in 2000. Investment by corporations in the developed countries was weak, and profits were very high, partly because of globalization. They shifted income to profits. And also income was shifted among earners towards the top. So the tendency was for savings, desired savings, also to rise in our economies. And we responded to that, monetary policy responded to these pressures, this sort of global savings glut, as it's been called, by pursuing very accommodative, even aggressive monetary policies and supporting a huge credit boom. And they worked quite well, because one of the effects of the savings glut was very low real interest rates, which raised house prices particularly, and that allowed a number of countries to experience huge credit booms. And then this was interacted with the financial liberalization, and that permitted the emergence of much bigger balance sheet in the financial sector, all sorts of new, rather opaque instruments, which were exactly what people looking for higher yielding but safe securities wanted, the so-called AAA rated collateralized debt obligations. So that's the second point. That's how it happened. And the third point is we've had a relatively conservative response to this. We've tried to keep the system together more or less as it is. We've kept essentially the same monetary policy arrangements, not really changed those at all. We've tried to preserve essentially the same financial sector, but more heavily regulated, much more heavily regulated, with a very complicated rule book, but essentially even more concentrated than before, even fewer competitors, but because the so-called shadow banking sector shrank. And I argue that despite all these best efforts, it still remains a very fragile system. And we need to think about more radical alternatives, and I discuss in particular two: much higher capital, and also the possibility of making banks completely safe with 100% reserve banking for deposits, to make deposits truly safe. And then finally I look at demand problems, both in the short term and the long term, and I argue that we should have been more aggressive in generating demand, and we need much more rebalancing of the whole economy, domestically and internationally, to avoid getting back into the same trap as we were in before the crisis. Well, it seems to me that here we have an enormous crisis, which was a surprise. And I mean by this not that there was a failure to forecast it. It seems to me inevitable that such events in any degree of precision cannot be forecasted. They could be, then they wouldn't happen. But I think the general consensus of policymakers and most economists in the West was that it was inconceivable that we got beyond a crisis of this scale. Not everybody thought that. There were some wise figures who understood the risks, but there were very, very few. And what is surprising to me is that the last time economists got everything wrong, which was in the 70s with the great inflation, there was a real upheaval in thinking about the economy, the role of markets, and the role of monetary policy, the monetarist counter-revolution. But this time, actually, economics seems to have gone on almost as if nothing had happened. It's almost unscathed. And this is particularly true, I think, of macroeconomics. There's been a bit more innovation and thinking about financial economics. But one of the problems is financial economics and macroeconomics became almost completely separated. And that separation, I think, remains to this day. What I would like is for economists to recognize that there were heterodox thinkers like Hyman Minsky who argued that we had a fundamentally unstable financial and monetary system, that if we didn't watch out very closely for what was going on inside it, it could create conditions for an enormous crisis, and this crisis very much fits into his template, and that these sort of heterodox ideas have to be brought into the mainstream. It will be much less elegant. You can't have simple, elegant models of the type that economists like, but they don't seem to be very accurate, and having beautiful models which aren't very accurate is not very helpful. Well, I would set out, probably in the case of the UK, a plan to get our capital ratios in our banks probably up to about 10 to 1 instead of, as they are now, about 20 or 25 to 1. And I would give them a certain deadline to raise the needed capital, and this would particularly apply to the ring-fence retail banks. The investment banks I would probably leave as they are, because they're operating in an international environment. Just make completely clear that the British government in no way stands behind them. But the retail banks will be really solidly capitalized in that way. I would also be thinking very seriously about expanding public sector investment. I think with very, very low real interest rates, exceptionally low real interest rates, the government can afford to borrow in order to invest. This is a country which still has a very poor infrastructure by the standards of other developed countries. We can sensibly invest more. Well, I'm just in the middle, and I haven't decided yet how far I agree with it, but it's very interesting, Richard Koo's latest work. Richard Koo is a Chinese-Japanese economist who sort of invented the term balance sheet recession, which he really took. It's a modern update of Irving Fisher's famous debt deflation idea, which is a very important idea in macroeconomics of depressions. And Richard Koo put forward the idea that you can explain the long malaise after a crisis, which you saw in Japan and now more recently in the US and UK for quite a few years, and then the Eurozone, as the result of balance sheet recessions. People who are over-indebted, cutting their spending, stopping investing, doing everything to reduce their debt, and that lowers demand in the economy, be it households or corporates, and governments have to step in. So he's updated this view, particularly looking at the Eurozone crisis, which he thinks has been very, very seriously mishandled. I'm about a third of the way through, and it is a very interesting analysis. And it raises this profound question, which is one of the questions that has been re-emerged in this crisis, which is the proper balance in a crisis of this kind, in a depression or slump of this kind, between fiscal and monetary policy. What is the right balance? And I happen to think, I'm one of those people who think you should use both. Some people think monetary policy is all you need, and the monetarists, people like Scott Sumner in the US, Tim Congdon here probably, and on the other hand there are the people who think that really all you need is fiscal policy, and that's very much Richard's view, and I like to be challenged by his perspective, which is a bit different, and I think it looks like a very, very interesting book.